Sorry, the host muted me. I'm sure it wasn't my fault. So as I was trying to say, sorry for this bumpy start. We're on to Dhammas. And just in case you haven't downloaded the latest version of the notes, one of the typos that I made was I left off the main heading of Dhammas. So somewhere on page 14, you should have a heading that says Dhammas and followed by the Hindrances. So the Hindrances is the first section of the Dhammas section. And in the Majjhima Nikaya version of the Satipatthana Sutta, you've got a number of subheadings under Dhammas. So what the sutta looks at is the hindrances, the 5 skandhas, the sense spheres, the awakening factors, and the 4 noble truths. I said earlier in the retreat that there are 3 different versions of the Satipatthana Sutta still kind of extant. There's 2 Chinese versions. One that comes from the Mahasangika tradition, and one that comes from the Sarvastivada tradition. And they have different listings of Dhammas. And I won't go into all the kind of details of the history of these texts, like I don't know that much about it. But Bhante in the seminar goes to the trouble to point out that the Pali Canon is one of the most complete records of the Buddha's teaching, but it's likely not to be the earliest version of the teaching. So like for example, the Theravada, which is the school that gave rise to the Pali Canon, came out of a school called the Sthaviravada. And the Sthaviravada was formed at what was called the Second Buddhist Council. The Second Buddhist Council, I think, was about 100 years after the death of the Buddha. And it was the first big split in the Buddhist Sangha. And on one side was the Mahasangikas. And they were called the Mahasangikas because they were the biggest of the 2 groups. The Sthaviravada had wanted a more strict reading of the Vinaya, which the main council did not agree with. So that became the first sort of split. The Sthaviravada sort of split from the Mahasangikas. The Theravada and the Sarvastivada both derive from that Sthaviravada branch. But it means that the Mahasangika texts are likely to be at least as old, if not older, than the Theravadan texts that have survived. The only reason the Theravadan texts survived is they were preserved in Sri Lanka when Buddhism mainly died out in India. So although it's the most complete set, it might not be the earliest set of teachings. In fact, it's likely not to be the earliest set of teachings. So one of the reasons for that preamble is to say that if you look at the 3 different texts, there are only 2 elements that all 3 of them share. And those 2 elements are the hindrances and the awakening factors. So that's likely to have been the original core of the text. Perhaps at least it's the shared material between the schools before they went their separate ways. I came at the Satipatthana Sutta really from the Anapanasati Sutta. I found the Anapanasati Sutta such a helpful way of looking at practice. But in doing the practice, quite a lot of questions came up about what really you were attending to in different Satipattanas. So that got me looking at the Satipatthana Sutta. That got me kind of interested in the content, a lot of which was helpful. But one of the things that quite puzzled me was how complex the Dhammas section was. So I had come from this, what I think is a beautifully simple structure in the Anapanasati Sutta. So you look at impermanence, the impermanence deepens into Viraganupasana, deepens into the sort of relinquishment, the cessation, deepens into the letting go. Very sort of clear, a single process. But in the Satipatthana Sutta, you've got this, it looks like broader range of topics, like certainly in the Majjhima Nikaya version. And even with the hindrances, I always kind of wondered why the hindrances weren't in the mind section, and why they turn up in the Dhammas section. And having a look at the sutta a bit more, I think one of the differences is that the Anapanasati Sutta is a single meditation instruction. So it's a very simple sort of sequence of experience that you're following. And the Satipatthana Sutta is trying to do a different job. It's trying to describe a whole path that includes meditation practice and includes meditation instruction, but isn't confined to it. So in a way, it's sort of setting its boundaries wider. It's looking at a whole spread of experience and even a whole spread of practices in a way that the Anapanasati Sutta is not trying to do. And if you were to try to sum up what the Dhammas section is doing, Analio's got a nice one-liner, and he says, the task of the fourth Satipatthana is to monitor the mind on the path to liberation. And two essential components of this path are overcoming the hindrances and cultivating the factors of awakening. So all the way through the Satipatthana Sutta, you get this contrast set up. So like in the feelings section, you've got the worldly and the unworldly. In the mind section, you've got the mind coloured by craving or aversion or delusion, the mind free from craving, aversion and delusion. And what you're looking at in this section, it seems to me, are the two basic shapes, two basic patterns that the mind takes. And basically, it's the pattern of the mind being caught in the habits that lead to dukkha, and the mind starting to move into the unfolding current of experience that leads to liberation. So the two, in a way, you've got two different descriptions of conditionality. I think you've got the cyclic conditionality and a description of that in the five hindrances. And then you've got even more explicitly the sort of spiral, the creative conditionality described by the awakening factors. And to go back to Analio, what you're doing is you're starting to notice when the mind is tending towards the hindrances and when it's tending towards liberation. You're setting up the conditions that unhook us from the hindrances and setting up the conditions that align us with that current that the factors of enlightenment describe. So that's the basic shape, I think, of this chapter. And what I suggest we do is just have a look at the hindrances and then maybe a bit more briefly the awakening factors. So can we do that? Just have a look at the text itself. No, takes, great. John says I can. Thumbs up. Thank you, John. Let's just sort of read the text to begin with. So I hope even if you've got the new version, we're still on page 14. And this is, I imagine, a pretty familiar framework that we're looking at here. So hindrances, how, monks, does one in regard to Dhammas abide contemplating Dhammas? Here in regard to Dhammas, one about contemplating Dhammas in terms of the 5 hindrances. And how does one in regard to Dhammas abide contemplating Dhammas in terms of the 5 hindrances? And it goes on, if sensual desire is present in him, or in one knows there is sensual desire in me. If sensual desire is not present, one knows there is no sensual desire. And then it goes on, one knows how unarisen sensual desire can arise, how arisen sensual desire can be removed, and how a future arising of the removed sensual desire can be prevented. So you get that pattern for all 5 of the hindrances, for aversion, for sloth and torpor, for restlessness and worry, and for doubt. And you're looking at, is it present? Is it not present? How does it arise? How can it be removed? And how can we stop it arising in the future? So that's the range that the sutta is trying to bring to our attention. Let's see if we can get a little bit of discussion out of this. First of all, do people know this framework? When I was a young Buddhist, this was one of the things that got drummed into you, the 5 hindrances and how you worked with the hindrances. I'm not sure I was always very good at working with it, but it was a very familiar framework. And I might be a bit out of touch now, and I'm just sort of interested in how, but first of all, do people know this material? And secondly, is this a framework that people actually use helpfully in their practice? So be interested to hear from a couple of people. Naravira's keeping an eye on the...
Trisha.
Thank you. I'm very familiar with it, and in the beginning of practice, I was very focused on the hindrances, and in retrospect, I think it would have been more helpful for me to focus more on the awakening factors. I think my tendency is to go to what's wrong or what's the obstacle or what's difficult, and I don't think, looking back now, that I had a kind of stable enough solid ground in terms of positive emotion and then later the awakening factors. So that would be my kind of own experience. I was just thinking it would have been lovely to hear this way back in the beginning, even though I wouldn't have understood a lot of it. But this teaching, which puts it in a different context, I think the context is important.
Oh, and if you don't mind, Trisha, how would you see the context as being different? How does it change that?
I think when you're talking about the natural states, I mean, getting to the natural positive states, and focusing on the positive in meditation, for example, with that it would naturally arise. There'll be a natural falling away of the hindrances for me, in my practice, in focusing more on the positive, focusing more on the awakening factors. The hindrances kind of fall away rather than me having to proactively challenge them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so that's what my experience in this teaching is. It's been about having a more positive context, that actually this is where our tendency could be, and that the obstacles will fall away. I don't know if that explains it.
Yeah, no, that's good. So before, maybe between the teaching and your own temperamental emphasis, a bit too much emphasis on what can go wrong, and this puts it in a more kind of thorough grounding, a kind of building up of helpful, positive supports for skillful mental states. Yeah,
definitely. Thank you.
Other people with, what's your experience of the hindrances or your familiarity with it?
Lisa, if you do you like to say something?
Yeah, it's just a quick question. This bit, does it regard to the fourfold efforts?
Yeah, so the fourfold efforts is the prevention of the arising of the unskillful, eradication of the...
But is it similar to that? It just sounds like it's...
It's using that framework, isn't it? It's looking specifically at these unskillful things, looking at what's arisen, how you get rid of it, what's not arisen, how you prevent it. And so that's the framework that's being applied to these hindrances. Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to say thank you.
Good, thank you for pointing that out.
Sorry.
Ali?
Hi. I just, I thought I'd mention when a useful way in for me to work with the hindrances was Tejananda spent some time with us. Can't remember when that was. It was recently. And he was talking about the hindrances in terms of how you might notice them in the body. So not necessarily as mental states, but more somatically, in terms of just the direction of your body and your leanings, or just where the energy was moving. And I found that a really helpful way to relate to the hindrances.
And what was helpful about it?
Because it was bodily based, and so it felt more, I don't know, just felt more accessible for me to work with it in that way.
Mm-hmm. And so a bit less sort of abstract and a bit more directly, sort of tangibly there in your experience, looking at it in the body.
Yeah, and also not getting caught in the something to get rid of or something that is bad. I like the whole language of hindrances, for not finding that particularly helpful, but just more as a movement in the body, so that the correction is more around, if just what I need to do with my body, which doesn't feel like a wrong or a right. That's just what's arising and what the response is. Does that?
It does. So it's a bit less sort of moralistic, and it's a bit more just a kind of natural realignment or a natural adjustment, something like that.
Yeah, just a more based in nature, that sometimes the ground is hard and sometimes it is soft, and
And I think that's helpful, because I do want to try and, like the Buddha's kind of suggesting the language of hindrances and the language of awakening factors. There is definitely a bit of an evaluation in there. Like the Buddha's not going for neutral language. He's definitely saying that there's something here that blocks awareness, and there's something here that supports awareness. And I understand that I think quite often we set hindrances up as an object out there, and we've got a kind of critical or even a self-critical relationship to. And I think we've got to get out of that kind of, as it were, judgmental response. But I think being able to, even what you're describing, Ali, that there's something there, that there's a readjustment that supports your practice, that there's still a noticing of energy blocked, and a feel for what frees the energy up. And to me, that capacity to be able to tell what blocks the awareness and what allows the awareness to be more open and more free is quite an important skill. I think we have to be able to make that discrimination, that without it becoming a big, kind of ground for failure or a ground for self-criticism or something like that. But the capacity to distinguish, to me, I think is quite an important aspect of this. What about any other experiences of working with this framework of hindrance and positive factors?
John? John?
I've certainly used the framework, but more a while ago than I have recently. Probably at one time I can reel off all the list of antidotes in Kamala Sheila's book, but I certainly couldn't now. I've gone more recently for using imagery in a kind of intuitive sense. So if I'm kind of tuning in at the beginning, I might say, well, where am I at the moment? And then I might have an image of, say, some water that's kind of choppy on the surface because of the wind. And then ask myself, well, what do I need to do? And that might be actually go below the surface, and it's more kind of serene there. And
so that the images kind of work as a way of clarifying what you're trying to do. But I hope it doesn't come as too much of a shock if I remind you that water chopped up by waves is actually a scriptural image of the hindrances. So you're impeccably orthodox in using that.
Oh, I'm being accused of being impeccably orthodox.
Yeah. Sorry.
I'll have to live with that. That's okay.
but just sort of even there, I'm kind of making the case for the hindrances, that there's still the mind recognizing something that's not helpful, and then the mind recognizing something that supports a deeper experience. So there's a kind of discrimination being made and a choice being made about direction.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
I agree.
Can I ask a slightly different question? I think one of the things that helps a reading of the text like this is just to drop our own judgments for a minute and just do a kind of sympathetic reading and try to get at what is it the text is trying to say. So if we dig below the history, if we find out that in a 2,500-year-old recension of the Buddhist teaching, the two elements that three different traditions have kept are the hindrances and the awakening factors. So for 2,500 years, three different preservations of this text, that distinction has survived in the text. Why is that, do you think? What's this trying to get at? And while you're talking, I'm just going to plug my iPad in. Excuse me for a moment while you think. I'm just making at least the hypothetical case for the hindrances and the awakening factors. How come this has survived? How come it's there in such a central text? Adra?
Well, I suppose the obvious answer is because it's in my experience, it's a very human thing that I experience these in myself as being alive and present, that a tendency to reenact and a tendency to grow, and a tendency to grip and a tendency to open into the new, and just feel that they feel so it feels so in accord with being human somehow.
And from the point of view of your practice, helpful to have your attention brought to them?
Definitely. I think it's it's certainly, it's such a sort of a primal switch somehow, that shift from being in a in a pattern of a well-worn rut, and a release into sort of fresh, open space somehow. So yeah, it's definitely
sort of release from what you habitually do. Release into something fresh and open.
Yeah, definitely.
Anybody else willing to make the case for sort of what you think the text is trying to give us as a tool?
Trisha?
The thing that occurs to me is that without it, sometimes the hindrances feel so good. And so it's quite nice to have them pointed out as not helpful, so you don't have to follow that video all the way to the end to find the consequence of it. So yeah, in balance. All
right, so it's a bit of information about mental states that might be helpful.
Beata, did you have something?
Yeah, it's I was just thinking there's something about it being a map, and obviously a map that is helpful. And I personally, I always see them as a mandala or like a double vajra sort of. And I notice I come back to that sort of structure, sort of something about you know, sky, earth, or you know, it's a hindrances, either too much energy, not enough. What is the other? You know, pushing away, grasping, and there's something in the middle. You know, there's something about that. I don't know. There's something about the structure, about the map of these. You know, something in the middle and 4 points. That's how, I don't know if that makes any sense, but I just wonder if that's also something that seems to come up again and again in the teachings. I don't know if there's also something we respond to. I mean, a bit what Ali said about, I can sort of feel it in my body that this is true as well, but I can't quite explain it. But yeah.
You certainly get patterns within them, don't you? You get craving and aversion as a pulling towards and a pushing away, and traditionally craving, aversion, and restlessness are seen as high energy hindrances, and sloth and torpor and doubt are seen as low energy hindrances. So there are different pairings of how the mind can move off experience. Well, go on, Beata.
Yeah, and then there's something coming back into the center, and I always see that as a sort of, you know, the non-dualistic sort of whole. You know, but we do, because of the way our mind is structured, we go to these sort of poles.
Yeah. So there's a point of balance in the middle.
Yes, or you could see it around, you know, wider. That's how sort of I relate to it. It might be a bit weird, but
no, next I like the patterning of it. If you don't mind, I wanted to come back, maybe I hope picking up a bit on a point that Ali made. And I think one of the things that shifted my sense of the hindrances is that the way Ali was describing it, you're sort of feeling something in your body. You're kind of almost viscerally feeling that something's not quite as it ought to be. And there's an almost sort of natural readjusting into something that feels more whole or more kind of relaxed or released or something. I won't put words into Ali's mouth. But for me, one of the shifts was feeling that the hindrances aren't so much problematic objects of awareness. They're qualities of relationship to experience. and you're working with them quite directly, quite simply in any meditation practice. So as soon as you're starting to attend to the breath, you're moving into a kind of clear awareness. And if you feel the mind being pulled off because you're grasping after something else, there's just a sort of natural readjusting of coming back to attending. So in a sense, working against the hindrance is just noticing that there's a relationship that's moving you away from connection, or there's a relationship that's moving you away from openness. And there's a sort of natural or even an intentional adjusting of coming back to attend to it. Or if you find yourself resisting something, you feel what resistance is like. And you know that the kind of what you're trying to do in the meditation is connect. So it's almost like you're looking at the quality of the energy. You're looking at the quality of the attention. And whenever you disconnect, you respond by connecting. Whenever you distract, you respond by settling back onto what you're attending to. John's image of whenever the water's choppy, you get below the surface and back into something that's a bit more still, that allows us to come back into relationship. And for me, that kind of slightly depathologized the hindrances. You know, it wasn't this problematic object that I somehow had to get rid of. I just realized it was describing a relationship to experience that was painful. You know, like if I was trying to tightly hold, if I was trying to push away, just catching those qualities of attention and releasing into connection, releasing into attention. Like for me, that kind of correction to the quality of my availability to experience was what was being described. So I don't know if that would be helpful for anybody or not. It seems to me as soon as you're working with the quality of your awareness in meditation, in a way you're moving from the hindrances, or what the hindrances are describing, into the awakening factors and what the awakening factors are describing. As soon as you're paying attention, as soon as you're opening up, as soon as you're attending to calm, you're moving from hindrance into awakening factor. And the two structures are just describing that very kind of simple, fundamental process of where our awareness is moving to. Can we look a little bit at what we're being asked to do in the hindrances? So the next line, having described what the hindrances are, it tries to go on to what you might do about it. So let's see if we can find a way of working that isn't quite as pathologizing or as problematic as perhaps some of our ways of doing it have been. So we can take any hindrance. It's the same set of instructions in each of them. So if you don't mind, I might take aversion, which is my favorite. And so if aversion is present in us, one knows that aversion, that there is aversion in me. If aversion is not present, one knows there is no aversion in me. So again, let's try and be a bit sort of sympathetic. What is it that the text is sort of suggesting to us? What's the text suggesting that might be helpful in our practice? What's this first instruction getting at?
Sally has a hand up, but I don't know if it was in relationship to that or a previous question. You need to unmute yourself, Sally. Okay.
Sally, did we lose you?
We might have lost her, yeah. Okay. Lisa, you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, I forgot what I was going to say. Can you just repeat what you just asked? Because I pressed it and then I forgot what you said then.
All right, sorry. So I read a bit of the text, and the text was saying,
Oh yeah,
if
yeah.
a
Yeah,
version
sorry,
is
but
present, you know it's
that was
present.
it. So is it saying basically, even if your mind, you know, you've got a version or a craving, is it saying like you've got it, but you know you're aware of having it?
Yeah,
Is
that's
that what
exactly
you're
what it's saying. And why? What difference does that make?
Well, because you're not lost in it then, are you? You're not
Yeah.
you can sort of what like a bit separate from yourself kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, like observe it rather than get lost in it.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's sort of two things, isn't it? One is just the recognition of it. So you kind of know what's going on in your mental state. And then in a way you're saying the second thing, Lisa, that in that knowing, you're not lost in it. So the sort of thing we've been describing in the feelings tetrad of being available to mental processes, but not caught in the mental processes. So the sort of first step is just the seeing. And if possible, a kind of seeing where the awareness starts to become the main experience rather than the aversion or the craving or whatever being the shaping experience. So yeah, so you're recognizing it, you're not lost in it. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
Sally?
Thank you. I can see what you're saying about the attending, meaning that you could flow more quickly from the recognition of a hindrance. You'd almost automatically flow into the awakening factors within meditation. But I'm thinking about the experience of daily life in connection with this, if it's all right to say something about that.
No, sure.
Because, the awakening factors, I may be the only person on the Zoom call who hasn't come across them before. These are new to
You might not be, Sally.
as far as I'm aware,
Yeah.
they're new to me. I've had a lot of teachings and I might have not connected with this one. And I'm seeing enormous value in those, kind of beyond what you said, because I had an experience yesterday where I got a phone call from someone saying my cousin had died suddenly.
Oh, goodness.
And I was aware immediately of a very strong emotion of aversion, because the person speaking to me had damaged our family a few years ago. And some of my family had ostracized her since. So there was a lot of, I didn't feel like that, but there was a lot of emotion suddenly came up. I was the one being contacted. I had to somehow manage this within the family. And I think if I'd known about the awakening factors and almost had that list up on my wall, I'd have had sort of somewhere to go to immediately, because I had to go into compassion straight away. And one of my questions is, it interests me that compassion isn't one of the awakening factors. And I think your answer might be, well, if you go into tranquility and joy and energy and all of those, or any of those, you'll go into compassion and right effort and right speech and so on. But the awakening factors seem to me to be of really substantial value in daily life. Yeah. Because of what you might encounter when you're not in a contemplative state, when you're hit by something. So that was the thought that I had.
Yeah, no, very interesting, Sally. Just frame my place again. A slightly kind of dramatic point that Sangharakshita makes in the seminar. So he's talking about the factors that cause arising and the factors that stop the hindrances arising. And he says, basically, meditation is first aid. If you're working with the hindrance in meditation, you're a first responder. So you're dealing with a mental state that's presenting immediately. But it says basically what we're working with in meditation is a continuation of the momentum of our minds that we create in the rest of our lives. And if we're serious about the shift from the mind caught in the delusion, the kleshas, whatever, into something that's liberating, investigation into how the hindrances arise probably takes us off the cushion and back into what our minds habitually do in the rest of our experience. So to start to attend to the quality of our mental states in moment-to-moment experience starts to become a necessary part of the whole process of liberation, of setting up the conditions for liberation. So thanks for, in a way, kind of opening that part of it up, Sally. I sort of wonder, I'd be interested just what people make of that, sort of that relationship between on the cushion and off the cushion mental states. Does that make sense? Meditation first aid. I was a little puffy, so it kind of stopped for a minute when I read that. A couple of people nodding. Somebody want to comment on that?
Ali? Or Kath? Kath?
No, I can just going to say that I can totally recognize that. I think when I go into meditation or I sit down, it's if I've got a lot on or I'm trying to sort out a lot, perhaps with work or anything, my mind's much more distracted, you know, than if I've got more space in my life. And yeah, so and just through coming through this rains retreat, I've been seeing that even more clearly and starting to get a sense of, is this a helpful mental state or not, you know, but I'm sort of working with that in my everyday to-day life, and I can sort of see how that's going to go back into my meditation. So I could definitely see the link.
All right, and something about the retreat gives a little bit more space around that. You can kind of see the habits a little bit more.
And I think it's something that is sort of up the ante. I can really see the benefit of it. I said it in my group this morning. There's something about, wow, I can really see why one would want to put the effort in, because of what one would get back from it. So it's kind of sparked my interest to put my energy behind it.
Yeah, great. Other angles on this? So that, let's just stick with the fact of it first. Sort of meditation is first aid, undoing the harm that we've done in the rest of our day when the hindrance arises. Any other responses to that, or that relationship between meditation and the rest of our experience?
Can I say something? Yeah, so I think my experience over the years with myself and teaching others is that meditation can quite easily just become a theoretical event, especially, for example, the metta practice, where people are thinking about metta rather than experiencing it deeply and being metta. And so I very much have seen body work as that bridge between taking meditation from an on the cushion activity to the bridge into everyday life by watching and really working with the body existential sort of in a practical way, and bringing those teachings into our movement. Anything that you do, yoga, running, swimming, is an opportunity to do that, and walking. And the more and more that is practiced, and rather than just being something that you do sitting on the cushion, otherwise it is just a theoretical endeavor. So for me, that's been very much the thrust of developing my interest in encouraging others into body work over the years.
And I wonder if I might just say a little bit more about that. So for you, body work as an effective bridge off the cushion into kind of ordinary experience. Just I maybe kind of missed it in what you were saying, but how does that work? What is it that lets the body work be a kind of vehicle for that, a support for that?
Because it's bringing it more in a very practical way in the everyday. So, for example, if I'm swimming, I'm aware of tightness. I'm aware of my focus. I'm aware of my, and when I do the body work, when I bring it into the body work, the hindrances seem to slip away far more quickly, and I seem to be more fully present and more fully aware. And it's interesting that some of the more recent investigations into the body and what the body holds the score, that whole thing about how the psychology, the emotions long term get trapped in the body, and you can see it in people. And so by working on that actively, we're bringing space and we're bringing liberation to our energy and to what flows through the body and what we bring into our interactions with others.
No, great. That's really clear, and it's good, solid Satipatthana teaching, isn't it? That you're starting off with the breath and the body, and that's the foundation for everything that follows. So that kind of attention to what's showing up in your body kind of works as a way of monitoring the quality of your experience.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's been no coincidence that I've started workshops for many years now with the Anapanasati practice, because it is just such an obvious way of it goes from the gross to the more subtle as such, and that range of experience, and I echo what was said before, that the beauty of the hindrances is that it's a map of our inner realm and where we normally can be at, and then to have the awakening factors, that's the Dharma saying, okay, this is where you're at, acknowledge it, look at it, recognize it without judgment, keeping it real, and as opposed to how we might want it to be, and then we can use that as a basis from the seeing things as they really are to then move on to more and more of those awakening factors in our being.
Great. So you've got Sally sort of raised the question about how the hindrances, the awakening factors sort of impact on daily experience. You've got Bhante saying that basically what shows up in our meditation is to a large extent going to be a continuation of what our minds habitually do. And you've got Dhammarati talking about using the body as a way of sort of that becoming a touchstone or a channel that allows those kind of fresher, more skillful mental states be sustained. And where my own mind was going, I was kind of interested in if the job is changing the whole momentum of the mind stream. So look, you're not going to do that in 40 minutes out of 24 hours. There needs to be some way of engaging with the whole stream of experience. So if that makes sense as a proposition, I'm kind of interested in how other people manage to take that more sustained engagement with mental states out into the time off the cushion. So you've got Dhammarati describing doing it with body work. How else do people do it? Is this framework making sense? Where I'm sort of taking the framework as given and asking how you do it, but we can still have a question about the framework if you want. Can I just tell you a thing about hands? People are hitting the applause button, which I love, right? It means I'm on the receiving end of all these little hands clapping, but it's different from putting a hand up. And what's great about putting a hand up is it moves you to the first screen. So it means that it's easy to see that you want to take part in the discussion. So if your software allows, if you can distinguish between that, which is going to get you involved in the discussion, and that which just makes me feel better about the discussion. That would be good.
I think Dhammarati people have been using it because they don't have the other symbol.
They don't.
No,
Right,
not everybody has it, depending on your screen. So people have been putting their hands up. I think that's then just wanting to ask a question, such as Amanda, and she's had her hand up for a little while now. So over to you, Amanda.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I couldn't find that. I was just so applause as well, of course. Yeah, it's just in response to what you were saying about how you use a meditation and how it transfers into everyday life. I find by doing my meditation in the morning and slowing down enough to notice when aversion's coming up or I'm restless or whatever, it's just in meditation, it's quiet and you're slow enough to notice it. So then what I'm noticing almost automatically in everyday life, something will happen and I'll get that same feeling. And it's like, because I've meditated, there's enough of a gap for me to notice it. I don't immediately go in, and I'm just noticing that that's becoming more, it's happening more naturally, if you like, because I've meditated in the morning. It's almost like I can see the difference. But it's like I've got that kind of split second where I can kind of make a choice. I don't just go straight into it. And there might be something I'm going to say on the tip of my tongue, and I'll go, no, is that helpful? No, just don't say it. That kind of thing. So I don't react as quickly, or I'll go, do I really want to do that? No, I don't. Is that skillful? So it's like without the meditation, and if I don't do that, then I don't have that same ability to pick something up just before it happens. So
that's great. And again, if you don't mind, just trying to pick a couple of points out of that. Like, first of all, what you're describing is a kind of subtler relationship between meditation and ordinary experience, to use that term. So it's not that the meditation's just on the receiving end. It's like actually the meditation sort of starts to open up new possibilities that feed back in to what happens during the day. And then one of the specific things you were saying is that moment of awareness. So before the reaction kicks in, there's enough kind of presence of mind for a bit of choice to be available to you, and you get to choose which of those paths the mind goes down. No, great, that's really helpful, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you.
Claire Louise.
Hi, I was going to say kind of a little bit similar to what Amanda's just said, but maybe I notice more of a cumulative effect, that it's perhaps less day to day and more just the more that I practice, the more that I notice patterns of aversion or patterns of unskillful ways of being in my practice. And then when I'm in my everyday life, I think the first thing that happens is that I might still act or be in that way, but I'll notice it straight afterwards. Kind of notice it closer and closer to the event, and then start to notice it sort of kind of almost preempt it, notice it in advance, and then be able to make those choices. But it's a process of being able to kind of see it more clearly within practice. And then I think because you've seen it more clearly, because I've seen it more clearly in practice, then it's kind of just, it's sort of there in my awareness in everyday life. And then I'm catching myself sooner and sooner.
So that the meditation practice sort of gives you a bit of a taste of what's possible and what a more aware, less reactive state of mind is like. So you've got a bit of a comparison in your activity, and you can catch it earlier in the process as that goes on. Good.
Thanks.
Happy to carry on with questions.
Let's take one more and then let's have a wee bit of a break.
Okay. Ali's just put her hand out. So Tim.
Yeah, I don't know. I wanted to bring up examples, a kind of a mixture of right action and sometimes even extending it into ethics. So let me try and think of a very concrete example. I know that at certain times of the day, particularly about an hour after I've got up, I often feel a sense of torpor and even low mood sometimes. But I also know what I can do about that. And, you know, one of the things I will do is I will go out and walk in the back lane and around the allotment fields behind my house and listen to the birds. And I know there's a bird watching network we've got. I can compare what I'm finding with what other people are finding. And of course, that then builds up because it builds a sense of relationship with the world and how I can relate to the birds can relate to me. So I think, or another example I will give is, I know I can be very judgmental of people quite quickly and rapidly put them into a slot of like or don't like. But I know one way of dealing with that is just to get to know more about the person.
Yeah.
So if I have put them in that aversion category, there's even more reason for me to approach them and speak to them or try and do something with them, because I'll know nine times out of 10, I will find something that we share, or some prejudice or preconception of mine is just blown out of the water. So anyway, this is what your presentation is just bringing up for me at the moment, Dhammarati.
Yeah, in a way you were making a link with certain daily activities, but also with ethics, Tim, that what you're describing, that kind of interest in another person, is a really concrete way of moving against aversion, you know, kind of moving against preconception. And again, sort of a worry, I'm kind of labouring a point. Like I don't want to bring hindrances up just as a kind of criticism of us. It's almost more like, I think one of the things that this section is doing is it's putting the kind of glimpse that you get of deeper experience in a context of total transformation. So it's saying that you want the whole psyche involved, and more of our psyche involved in that process of transformation. So you've got what you can do on the cushion. You can work immediately with what arises. But the sort of thing that Amanda's been describing, Tim's been describing, it's like starting to extend that awareness so that you're sort of noticing when we're acting out of the constricting mental states, and when we're starting to work in line with a momentum that's moving towards aware and liberated mental states. And you know that the traditional Buddhist model is that expresses itself in mind and in speech and in body. And I was saying this morning about ethics as an insight practice. So if you're working again, if you're acting in the kind of sympathetic awareness of another person that Tim's describing, you're acting out of that first precept practice of shifting the habit of suspicion. This might not be true for all of you, but true for some of us, that the kind of habit of caution, of suspicion, and an intention to respond with kindness. And it means you've got a practice that works against the habit of aversion. If you're working with dana, the practice of dana, you're working against the deep habit of craving and bringing resources into ourselves. If you're acting out of the third precept of contentment, of stillness, you're acting against the restlessness. If you're working with fifth precept of mindfulness, you're working against the confusion of doubt. So you're looking at patterns of behavior, like Dhammarati was talking about the body work, that it's like the precepts are also ways of sort of setting up channels that allow those deep moments of experience to start to be a kind of a more influential current in the momentum of our whole unfolding experience. And there's a kind of middle ground as well, the sort of thing that Amanda was talking about, sort of question that Sally was raising, where you have these little moments of more awareness, and because more awareness, more choice. So you start to, like the little kind of qualitative glimpses that you get in meditation of what it feels like to be attentive to something, of what it feels like to be acting out of a deeper sense of connection to ourselves. You get more familiar with that. And in those moments of choice, you can just start to work out of that quality of awareness being sustained, that, like the mind training verse again, whenever disturbing emotions arise, may I firmly face them. So we get lost in the prapancha, but there's a feeling tone to awareness and a feeling tone to contentment that if we remember to stay tuned into, it's giving us a steer away from the hindrances and into the awakening factors. So I think that the reason for bringing this up after looking so subtly at the mind is it's just how do these moments of vision start to become transformation, and not just a kind of dutiful abidance by the precepts, but the precepts, those little moments of awareness, actually starting to be live channels for a more aware, more responsive relationship to our experience. So bringing in the hindrances and starting to notice the hindrance as habitual momentum of the mind, and starting to unhook from them opens up this new possibility of the awakening factors. Should we have a cup of tea and have a look at the awakening factors? About the awakening factors. I'm tempted to do this as a sitting practice, but I think we don't have time to do it justice. So actually, we can do it tomorrow a bit more length as a sitting practice. But if you don't mind, just trying to get a little bit of a sense of the shape of it in this session that we've got right now. So singling them out, you've got similar pattern to the hindrances. We're being asked to look at whether or not a mindfulness factor is present. We're being asked to look at, if it's not present, how it can arise. And we're being asked to look, once it's arisen, how it can be perfected, how we can deepen it. And the sequence is mindfulness, investigation of Dhammas, energy, joy, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. And I think it's true that what you're looking at again is an unfolding sequence. It's a kind of description of a kind of stream of experience where each section kind of arises out of the one before. Any comments on the shape of it? Sort of mindfulness, investigation of Dhammas, energy, joy, tranquility, concentration, equanimity. Ring any bells, either in your own experience or other frameworks that you're aware of?
I've got a question actually.
Go on, Tim.
Of the list that's there of the awakening factors, they're all familiar except the investigation of Dharma's awakening factor. That seems to be a very tight circle. It's just switching on itself. I don't immediately know what is meant. The investigation of Dhamma's awakening factor.
Yeah. Sorry to put you in the firing line, but would you like to speculate about what it might mean?
Well, it's something to do with having an interest, having a curiosity, is it?
Yeah, that would be the start of it.
As to what's going on, and kind of not being dull, maintaining that curiosity about life and what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, to answer the question, not to kind of draw it out too much, I think that the main thing that's been said is exactly the discussion that we're having right now. So the first step is mindfulness. So we've just spent a few days looking at mindfulness and what the experience of mindfulness in body, feelings, mind is like. And you've got that as the start. And then we're in this framework where we're looking at hindrances and awakening factors. And what I would say is that the investigation of Dhammas. So first of all, it's just this presence to, attention to what's happening in the mind. So Dhammas for shorthand is objects of the mind, what the mind attends to. But I think that the main thing is this discrimination, if I can use that word, that you're starting to notice is what's present supporting a deepening experience, or is it limiting experience? So it's almost like right at the start of our practice, sort of first step is starting to pay attention to experience. Second step is getting a sense of what pattern is unfolding. Is it the reactive pattern that closes us down? Is it the creative pattern that opens us up? So I think the investigation of the Dhammas is not just being present to experience, but starting to get a sense of the shape that the stream of experience is taking. And again, it's not, it's simpler than it sounds, I think. Like Ali talking earlier about experience of hindrances in the body, like just that feeling tone that underlies all of the complexity of our experience, just starting to notice, does it feel like we're connected? Has it got that quality of clarity and connection to it? Or is it complex? Is it fragmented? Is it disconnected? So I think investigation of Dhammas is more and more as a sustained experience, kind of alive to the quality of awareness that's present and that's unfolding. And it's out of that aliveness, it's more and more setting up the momentum to move towards the awareness. So I think that's what investigation of Dhammas is getting at. Just, is it hindrances? Is it awakening factors? Does that make sense? Does that sort of address the question? I've lost you from my screen, Tim. So I don't know if you're scratching your head or not.
I was giving you a literal thumbs up, not a digital one. Yeah. Thank you.
Dhammarati and Aidan.
Could I just check with you that energy here is still virya? If so, what definition of virya are you leaning towards these days?
I'm leaning to whatever definition the Buddha leans towards. But yeah, it is virya. Yeah, and right. So try and get a feel for this. right? So just to pick up on Dhammarati's question, if we may. So the first step is mindfulness. And we've spent quite a bit of time looking at what mindfulness is opening up for us. So that the second one is this investigation of Dhammas. So you're starting to look at what's the quality of the unfolding experience. So it got the flavour of tight and closed and aversive. So it got the flavour of awake, aware, connected, just starting to be alive to the shape that it's taking. Then the third Dhamma factor, third awakening factor. So if you think of these as an unfolding sequence, what's that getting at? How is energy, the third factor, arising out of the first two? Anybody want to speak from their own experience or sort of have a wee guess? We'll come back to you. Aidan, do you want to respond to that? I know you had your hand up independently.
Sorry, I've still got my hand up for the previous one, so I'll let somebody else answer your. Well, I'd like to come back to the investigation just briefly in a minute, but
sure.
Somebody else wants to answer your question.
Check your own experience. When has Sally? You've got a hand up.
Trisha had a hand up. Did Sally have your hand up? No, maybe not. Trisha definitely.
Sorry.
I don't know if that was an answer to Dhammarati's question or not, Trisha.
Sorry, I did kind of put my hand up and then I took it down again quickly. Virya, I think for me, once I get clear, so from the first two, being mindful, and then whether it's helpful or not, whether it's something that's going to be helpful or not, then I can, if I find it to be helpful, then I can pay attention to that. And in paying attention to it, it seems to gather momentum.
Yeah. And say a little bit more, how come in paying attention it gathers momentum? How come? What's happening?
For example, if it's, sometimes I experience it as actual energy in my body feels different, or if it's, yeah, so in my body, say for example, something is, feels that it's helpful. So if I notice, say if I was working with Vedana in my body, something very tight and painful, or something that is more pleasant and relaxed, if I pay attention to the, if I pay attention, for example, to the bit that's it's more relaxed, it relaxes more. So like on a physical level. And if it's something like a prapancha in my mind, something that feels like it's tightening me or constricting, if I know what that is, instead of just running with that story, if I notice that that is prapancha, that's not helpful, then that of itself, that awareness of itself changes it. And then the energy from that is released, because it takes quite a lot of energy to hold that.
No, great. So you're sort of describing something where the energy is sort of lost in prapancha, it's confused, it's a bit fragmented, you're noticing it. In the noticing it, the prapancha stops, the energy gets freed up, it's available, and it's got a momentum. Something like that. And I'd say that's true about a lot of practice, that we've got a lot of energy tied up in confusion and conflict. And you start to take mindfulness in at step one. You start to take the investigation of mental states in step two. But there's a clarity about where we're caught. There's a clarity about what frees us. And in that process of freeing up, opening up the space, energy gets released. But there's I think there's a momentum towards growth, almost hardwired into us. And when you get a sense of the conditions that allow that unfolding, energy moves in that direction. So what Trisha's describing, I think you get a sense of how energy flows from the first two. Aidan and then Michelle.
Sorry, my daughter's just come in the door, but we'll carry on regardless.
Look after your daughter for a minute, we can come back to you.
No, well, I have just spoken to her, so she's okay, I think, with me carrying on. Yeah, so yeah, this about just kind of two parts to the question really, but they're sort of related. About we're talking about investigation. The recognizing the shape and quality of the feeling tones. In the previous group was talking about sort of having the capacity to distinguish between a distraction and an insight. Being honest with oneself and seeing the feeling tone, the nature of what's coming up. Because I did kind of confess that so quite often in meditation that I sort of take notes sometimes, not always, but especially on retreat, kind of stuff comes up in meditation, and then I sort of taking notes, and then I'm thinking, oh, is this distraction? Doesn't seem to fall under the hindrances in the sense that because there isn't actually a hindrance for distraction. And usually the
restlessness and worry.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, that usually people say, well, it falls under one of them, like restlessness or even ill will or sense desire, the things that are coming up. But sometimes I feel like this what comes up might be like a kind of curiosity or a speculation, which doesn't obviously fall into, but so then that leads back to my original point, which is, a kind of a vipassana aspect maybe arising once the mind has become calm, but it does have quite a conceptual aspect to it. So yeah, it's just kind of being honest. How can one really distinguish between a kind of wisdom or and just a sort of a Papancha style?
Yeah. And did your group come up with an answer?
Sorry?
Did your group come up with an answer?
I think actually Badra said wait till the end of the meditation, and you can, if it's wisdom, then you will remember it. And I suppose then but I suppose I could say then that's quite a good one, because there's an element of clinging, isn't there? Wanting to capture it and write it down. I do have sometimes when something comes up, I have a fear of losing it, that it's going to be gone. And so there is an element of, I suppose, clinging to it. Yeah.
I think a test for me would be whether or not it supports the experience going deeper. So if you didn't write it down and attended more closely to what was happening, would that support the awareness going deeper, or does by writing it down and having a record of something that you've seen clearly support a deeper awareness, or does it keep the mind on a conceptual level? So what's the nature of the experience? What supports that deeper sense of connection, that deeper seeing? So just what's the quality of the mental state that the activity supports? But let's do Michelle, and then I want just a couple of remarks to close.
Hi. I was just a question about, because I've recently come to the practice of jnanas, and I just absolutely love them, piti and sukha. So my question is, when I go into meditation and I'm mindful, and then my awakening factors come to the pit, I don't ever know whether to call it piti or pretty, then I go into my body of the feeling of the piti. Am I then
craving, because that is a joyful feeling of wanting to be in that energy of the joy. Because I've gone through the stages of getting to like a really blissful place with the pretty, and then going into sort of the more relaxed, laid back stage of sukha, like sudden bathing by a pool sort of thing.
Yeah.
But am I then, because I'm enjoying that energy within my body and experience, am I craving it?
Yeah. So again, I'm just going to quickly answer, but the traditional distinction that we touched on between worldly and unworldly pleasant, and a distinction that gets made between what's called Kamachanda and Dhammachanda, which is the will moving towards sense experience and the will moving towards spiritual experience. And I think the sort of test, and there's nothing at all wrong with close attention and openness to pleasurable experience. That the sort of test is, does it have the flavour of closing you down? Does it move into clinging? Or does it have the flavour of opening you up and deepening you? And if the momentum is to open up and deepen, then it's Dhammachanda. So I think this idea that any volitional move towards pleasant experience doesn't necessarily mean it's craving. You can have a strong move towards something that's deeply emotionally satisfying, and that's skillful. Great. Listen, last point I wanted to make, and again, sorry for labouring this, but to me, one of the crucial points about the awakening factors is back to this thing about conditionality. You're looking at a description of an unfolding process, and the whole kind of Buddhist map is that things arise in dependence on conditions. That if you put a condition in place, it sets up a momentum out of which the next step of that unfolding process arises. So what you're looking in the awakening factors is a description of something that if you start to look at the mindfulness, you start to look at the discriminating factors, you can tell the difference between the mind closing down and the mind opening up. Out of that, the energy that Trisha was describing towards the mind opening up moves you into the joy, the tranquility, that it's almost part of the nature of the mind. That this idea of that great quote from Subhuti, that there are currents in reality that move in the direction of liberation. And what's being described here is like some of the main elements of what that current looks like. And pretty much the awakening factors map on to the positive nidanas. They map on really closely to what we're doing in the Anapanasati practice. That connection to breath and body is the mindfulness. The body calming is the tranquility, the joy arising, the sukha arising. You can find that here, the mind concentrating, and then out of that concentrated mind, a different quality of relationship to the experience. So in the Anapanasati Sutta, you're getting a very, very similar process being described. It's the same process, just using a slightly different set of categories to describe it. And one of the things that we're trying to do in the practice is get a feel for that unfolding momentum, not just on the cushion, but as a flavour. It's two possibilities within our experience all the time. And we're starting to just move the energy into the investigation of the Dhammas and allowing the kind of natural movement towards awakening, towards liberation, to become a stronger current in our experience all the time. Again, back to this thing, it's a training. You know, like it's not going to suddenly be the nature of our experience, but spiritual growth is growth in consciousness. If you start to see that it's possible, that intentionality starts to open the space up. So this is describing how what we're doing in the sitting practice starts to find conduits out into the rest of our experience, and you set up this momentum towards transformation. So that's what's being described in this section. And tomorrow, let's go back to the sitting practice and just try and get a feel for that unfolding sequence. We've been touching on it already, but let's just try and focus a bit on that shape in the sitting practice. Again, excuse me for going so long over time. It's because you keep asking difficult questions. Thank you very much. Let's leave it there. I'll see you tomorrow.